Discarded like trash, James clutched his weathered coat tighter. Yesterday's billionaire, today's forgotten beggar. How quickly fortunes change. The bitter taste of failure lingered as he watched executives enter his former empire, their expensive shoes avoiding his outstretched cup. But James held something more valuable than their wealth, knowledge that could save them all. A homeless billionaire returns to riches isn't just his story. It's proof that sometimes you must lose everything to truly see. His calloused hands trembled with purpose. James Crawford pulled the threadbare blanket tighter around his shoulders, watching the first light of dawn crawl across the underpass he now called home. The cold had settled deep in his bones during the night, a persistent companion that never quite left him these days, even when the California sun blazed overhead. 58 years had carved lines into his face that told stories of both triumph and devastating failure, the latter now dominating every waking moment of his existence. He ran his fingers through his unkempt beard, remembering the days when personal grooming meant expensive barbers and tailored suits, when his name commanded respect in boardrooms across the country, when Crawford Technologies represented innovation and unstoppable success. Those memories felt like scenes from someone else's life now, flickering images of a man he barely recognized anymore. The sounds of morning traffic rumbled above, executives and office workers rushing to their jobs, completely unaware that the disheveled man beneath them had once controlled financial empires that shaped industries. James gathered his few possessions, a worn backpack containing spare clothes, a dog-eared notebook filled with calculations and business ideas, and the tarnished watch that no pawnshop would take because it was too damaged to sell, but he couldn't bear to throw away. It was the last remnant of his former life, given to him by his father, who had always believed in his brilliance, who had never lived to see either his meteoric rise or catastrophic fall. The irony wasn't lost on James, that he now measured time by the movements of the sun, rather than the broken hands of a once luxury timepiece that had survived when everything else had been stripped away. His morning routine had become ritual through necessity. Pack up before the police came to move him along, make his way to the public library for warmth and free internet access. Then to the community center where volunteers handed out sandwiches and coffee with expressions that varied from compassion to barely disguised disgust. James had learned which days offered shower facilities, at which shelters, which park benches were least likely to get him rousted by security, which dumpsters behind which restaurants might yield still edible discards when hunger overcame pride. The systematic efficiency he had once applied to running a billion-dollar tech company now served to manage his survival on streets that had no mercy for fallen titans. He had learned how quickly society forgot those who slipped from its highest echelons, how thoroughly invisible one could become when wearing second-hand clothes instead of designer labels. The crushing weight of failure pressed down on him with each step toward the library, his mind endlessly retracing the cascade of catastrophic decisions and betrayals that had dismantled his life. The venture capitalists who had pulled funding at the first sign of market instability, the board members who had turned against him when quarterly profits dipped, the innovation he had refused to pursue because he thought he knew better, all threads in the tapestry of his downfall. Sometimes in his darkest moments, he wondered if he deserved this punishment for his arrogance, for believing himself untouchable, for treating people as disposable assets rather than human beings with needs and dreams of their own. The man who had once fired employees without a second thought now understood vulnerability in ways he could never have imagined from the insulated comfort of his penthouse office. Settling at his usual computer terminal in the back corner of the library, James logged into his email account, one of the few digital connections he maintained to his previous existence. Most days brought nothing but automated newsletters and spam, occasional messages from distant acquaintances who hadn't yet heard of his downfall and were looking for investments or favors he could no longer provide. Today, however, a subject line caught his attention and sent his heart racing. Crawford Technologies' quarterly report, internal distribution only. Someone from his old company had mistakenly kept him on an email list, giving him access to information that should have been far beyond his reach now. His hands trembled slightly as he clicked to open the attachment, eyes widening as he scanned the contents, brain immediately processing the numbers in ways that had once made him a visionary in his field. Within minutes, James saw it. The critical flaw in the company's current business model, a fatal miscalculation in their expansion strategy that would collapse the entire operation within 6 months if not addressed. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, simultaneously devastating and exhilarating. His former company, the enterprise he had built from nothing, the legacy that had been ripped from his control, was heading toward destruction under its current leadership. But in this moment of clarity, staring at columns of numbers that told a story others couldn't read, James felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. His strategic mind, once worth billions, was still sharp, despite everything he'd lost. In this public library, surrounded by people who stepped around him as if he were invisible, the homeless man known as James Crawford formulated a plan that would either resurrect his shattered life or confirm that he truly had nothing left to offer the world that had so thoroughly rejected him. The Crawford Technologies headquarters stood like a gleaming monument to innovation against the San Francisco skyline, its curved glass facade reflecting clouds and sunlight in equal measure. James observed it from across the street, the building he had commissioned at the height of his success, now an inaccessible fortress. Security guards at the entrance would never allow someone of his current appearance past the lobby, yet somewhere on the 20th floor sat executives who were unwittingly steering his life's work toward annihilation. The quarterly report had revealed a fundamental shift in the company's direction, abandoning core technologies that had sustained growth for decades in favor of flashy acquisitions with little substantive value. James understood the allure of such moves. He had once nearly made similar mistakes before rigorous data analysis had proven their folly. His successors apparently lacked either his caution or his foresight, racing toward a cliff with the enthusiasm of those who couldn't recognize the abyss before them. For 3 days, James had formulated his approach, meticulously analyzing the company's public statements against the internal numbers he'd seen, identifying precisely where the strategic missteps had begun and how they could be corrected before catastrophe became inevitable. His notebook was filled with calculations and projections, the margins crowded with annotations that represented a roadmap to salvation. If only he could convince someone with authority to listen. The challenge seemed insurmountable. What executive would take advice from a homeless man, regardless of his identity? His former status wouldn't help him. Most believed he had lost his fortune through incompetence, rather than the targeted corporate sabotage and market manipulation that had actually destroyed him. His reputation had been systematically dismantled, alongside his financial empire, leaving him with no credibility in the very industry he had once dominated with visionary insight and uncompromising standards. The solution came to him while watching employees filter out of the building at day's end, recognizing a familiar face among them: Margaret Chen, once his executive assistant and now apparently still employed in some capacity by the company. Margaret had been with him from the early days, one of the few who had treated him with genuine respect rather than fear or obsequious flattery. He hesitated, pride warring with necessity as he contemplated approaching her. Would she even recognize him beneath the unkempt beard and shabby clothes? Would she hurry away, embarrassed by his fall from grace or afraid of what he might ask of her? The uncertainty nearly paralyzed him, but the stakes were too high for hesitation. This might be his only chance to prevent the collapse of everything he had built. his one opportunity to prove his mind still held value, even if his name no longer commanded respect in boardrooms and financial publications. "Margaret," he called, his voice rougher than he remembered, strained from disuse and the harshness of street living. She turned, confusion crossing her features before recognition widened her eyes. To her credit, she didn't flee or pretend not to know him. Instead, she approached cautiously, concern evident in her expression as she took in his disheveled appearance and the physical toll of his circumstances. "Mr. Crawford, is that really you?" The formality almost made him laugh. They had worked side by side for 15 years, yet even now she maintained professional distance. Perhaps it was easier for her to process the stark contrast between what he had been and what he had become if she kept their interaction within familiar parameters. He didn't blame her for the shock visible on her face or the way she glanced around nervously, clearly uncomfortable being seen speaking with someone who looked like he belonged on a street corner asking for spare change. Their conversation was brief but transformative. Margaret agreed to deliver his analysis to Richard Dempsey, the current CEO who had once been James's protégé before becoming his most ruthless opponent during the boardroom coup that had ousted him. She made no promises about its reception, cautioning him that Dempsey had systematically purged the company of anyone loyal to its founder, replacing institutional knowledge with his own chosen team of yes-men and trendy consultants whose strategies aligned with his vision, regardless of their viability. "The company culture has changed," she told him, a diplomatic understatement that nonetheless conveyed volumes about the toxic environment that had replaced the collaborative innovation hub James had cultivated. He handed over his notebook, pages flagged with the most critical observations, knowing this might be his only chance to save both the company and himself from complete obliteration. As Margaret walked away, clutching his life's work and his last hope, James felt simultaneously lighter and more terrified than he had in years. For 7 excruciating days, James waited. He haunted the public library, checking email hourly for any response, any acknowledgement that his analysis had reached its intended recipient. He spent nights beneath the underpass, unable to sleep, mind racing with additional insights he hadn't included, refinements to his strategy that might make his case more compelling. Had Margaret actually delivered the notebook, or had she discarded it out of loyalty to her current employer? Had Dempsey glanced at the ragged pages and thrown them away without reading, dismissing anything from his disgraced predecessor as worthless? The uncertainty was its own form of torture, worse in some ways than the physical discomfort of homelessness that had become his daily reality. At least hunger and cold were predictable enemies. Hope was a far more dangerous companion, offering possibilities that might shatter him completely when they inevitably proved false. On the 8th day, his email contained a message from an unfamiliar address with a Crawford Technologies domain. A terse request for a meeting that afternoon at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the corporate headquarters. No name was attached, no indication of the sender's identity or position, just coordinates for a rendezvous that might represent salvation or humiliation. James spent his last few dollars at a public shower facility, trimmed his beard as best he could with borrowed scissors, and put on his cleanest clothes, still visibly worn, but the best he could manage under the circumstances. Walking into that coffee shop required more courage than facing down hostile investors or negotiating billion-dollar deals ever had. He was acutely aware of every glance, every subtle shift away from him as customers registered his presence among their carefully maintained normalcy. He ordered nothing, unable to afford even the cheapest item on the menu, and waited at a corner table, fighting the urge to flee back to the relative anonymity of the streets where at least expectations matched his current reality. Richard Dempsey arrived precisely on time, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than James had spent on survival in the past year. His expression revealed nothing as he approached the table, nodding curtly in greeting, before sitting down across from the man whose company he had taken and whose life he had effectively destroyed. "Your analysis was thorough," he said without preamble, placing the notebook on the table between them. "A financial team has been working around the clock to verify your projections." The admission that he had taken James's work seriously enough to have it professionally evaluated sent a surge of validation through James's chest, momentarily easing the constant ache of worthlessness that had become his shadow. "They confirm what you've identified," Dempsey continued, something unreadable flickering across his features. Reluctant respect, perhaps, or the discomfort of acknowledging that the man he had displaced still possessed insights he desperately needed. "We've already initiated changes based on your recommendations. The question now is what role you might play in implementing the full strategic pivot required to avoid the scenario you've outlined." The offices of Halliday and Associates occupied the 15th floor of a modest building several blocks away from Crawford Technologies' gleaming headquarters. James sat in an uncomfortable visitor's chair, acutely aware of the disparity between his appearance and the professional environment. William Halliday, a corporate attorney who had once handled minor legal matters for Crawford Technologies during its early days, studied the contract spread across his desk with the methodical attention that had made him respected in legal circles, if not particularly wealthy or prominent. "They're offering you a 6-month consulting position," Halliday summarized, looking up from the document with an expression that mingled surprise and skepticism. "Substantial compensation, but no equity, no board position, and an extensive non-disclosure agreement that essentially prevents you from discussing any aspect of the company's situation with outside parties." The lawyer leaned back, folding his hands across his slight paunch. "They're desperate for your expertise, James, but they're also terrified of admitting publicly that you were right and they were catastrophically wrong." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on James, as he considered the offer that Dempsey had presented with barely concealed reluctance. After everything they had taken from him, his company, his reputation, his financial security, they now needed him to save them from their own incompetence. Part of him wanted to refuse out of principle, to watch from the sidelines as the empire he had built crumbled under their mismanagement. That vindictive impulse flared hot and immediate, a wounded animal's instinct to strike back at those who had caused its pain. But beneath that reactive anger lay something more complex. Thousands of employees who would lose their livelihoods if the company failed, technologies that could genuinely improve people's lives left undeveloped if the organization collapsed. And his own legacy permanently tarnished if his greatest creation became nothing more than a cautionary business school case study in corporate failure. "I need to know exactly what happened," he told Halliday, voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "Not just the business decisions that led to this precipice, but who orchestrated my removal and how they managed to strip me of everything." The story Halliday pieced together over the following hours painted a picture more calculated and devastating than even James had suspected. His ousting hadn't been merely opportunistic. It had been methodically planned by a coalition of board members and investors who had seen his ethical stance on certain technological applications as an impediment to short-term profit maximization. Led by Dempsey, they had quietly undermined him for nearly a year before the coordinated strike, spreading rumors among key investors, manipulating performance metrics to suggest stagnation under his leadership, and finally exploiting a temporary market downturn to justify their coup. The legal maneuvers that had subsequently left him financially ruined were equally deliberate: contractual clauses triggered by specific board actions, insurance policies rendered void by carefully documented management failures, personal guarantees called in simultaneously to ensure maximum damage with minimum recovery potential. "They didn't just want you removed," Halliday concluded grimly. "They wanted you destroyed, professionally, financially, and personally. Your continued success would have been a rebuke to their actions and their vision for the company. Understanding the calculated nature of his destruction should have deepened James's bitterness, but instead it brought unexpected clarity. This hadn't been random misfortune or the universe punishing his arrogance. It had been human beings making deliberate choices to protect their interests at his expense. There was something almost liberating in this recognition. The same intelligence and determination that had engineered his downfall could now be studied, understood, and potentially overcome. He wasn't facing an implacable force of nature, but rather a human system with inherent weaknesses and predictable patterns of behavior. The executives who now sought his help were the same individuals who had orchestrated his ruin, operating from the same fundamental motivations and constrained by the same psychological limitations. For the first time in years, James felt the stirring of something that had once defined his entrepreneurial success: strategic anticipation, the ability to see not just the immediate landscape, but 3, 5, 10 moves ahead in the complex chess game of business and power. "I'll take the consulting position," James informed Halliday, his decision crystallizing as he spoke the words. "But I need you to prepare additional documentation, a parallel contract that Dempsey won't see initially." The attorney raised an eyebrow, professional caution warring with curiosity. "I'm not asking you to do anything unethical or illegal," James clarified, recognizing the concern. "But I need protection beyond what they're offering and leverage they don't anticipate." He outlined his requirements, specific performance metrics that, if achieved, would trigger equity compensation, documented acknowledgement of his contributions to any recovery strategy, and carefully structured information rights that would give him visibility into operations without violating confidentiality obligations. Halliday nodded slowly as the elegant framework took shape, professional appreciation overcoming his initial reservations. This wasn't revenge, it was calculated restoration, a strategic pathway back to influence and security that utilized the very corporate mechanisms that had once been weaponized against him. The following morning, James stood outside Crawford Technologies for the second time that week, no longer an observer, but officially returning as a consultant. The security guard at reception did a double take upon reading the visitor badge authorization, clearly recognizing the name of the company's disgraced founder. The elevator ride to the executive floor gave James time to register the physical changes to the building he had designed. Artwork replaced, color schemes altered, even the fundamental energy of the space transformed from innovative excitement to corporate conformity. Dempsey was waiting in the conference room, flanked by Chief Financial Officer Eliza Matsui and Chief Technology Officer Victor Ramsey, both new additions since James's time. Their expressions ranged from undisguised hostility, Ramsey, to professional neutrality, Matsui, to tightly controlled anxiety, Dempsey. The contract sat unsigned in the center of the polished table, a physical manifestation of the power dynamic that had shifted ever so slightly in James's favor due to their desperation and his unique knowledge. "Before I sign," James said quietly, placing his worn backpack on the floor beside his chair, "I need absolute transparency about the company's current position. Not just the financial projections I've already seen, but the complete technological roadmap, customer retention metrics, and internal talent assessment." He met each of their gazes in turn, no longer the supplicant grateful for any acknowledgement, but the expert whose value had already been tacitly admitted by their invitation. "I can't provide effective solutions without comprehensive understanding of the problems." Dempsey's jaw tightened at the implied criticism, but he nodded curtly to Matsui, who opened her laptop and began displaying a series of dashboards and reports that confirmed James's worst fears. The company wasn't merely at risk, it was actively failing, hemorrhaging key talent, losing market share to more agile competitors and burning through cash reserves at an unsustainable rate. The technological innovations that had once defined Crawford Technologies had stagnated under leadership that prioritized financial engineering over actual product development. As the true scope of the crisis became clear through Matsui's clinical presentation, James felt a strange dual response: vindication that his analysis had been correct, and genuine grief for what had been lost through mismanagement of the company he had built with such care and vision. 6 weeks into his consulting role, James sat alone in the small office they had assigned him, deliberately located far from the executive floor, an arrangement he suspected was designed to minimize his visibility and influence within the organization. The space was functional but impersonal, lacking the touches that would suggest permanence or belonging. James preferred it that way. This wasn't about reclaiming his former position, but about executing a carefully calibrated strategy that had been taking shape since his first meeting with Dempsey. On his computer screen, columns of data told a story of incremental improvement. The bleeding had slowed, though the company remained far from healthy. His initial recommendations had been implemented with reluctant precision by teams that viewed him with suspicion and resentment, yet couldn't deny the effectiveness of his approach. The core technologies that had been neglected were receiving renewed investment. Speculative acquisitions had been paused for critical evaluation, and unnecessary executive perks had been quietly eliminated to preserve capital for essential operations. The transformation in James's personal circumstances had been equally calculated and measured. He had moved from homelessness to a modest studio apartment paid for by his consulting salary, furnished with only essential items rather than the luxury he had once taken for granted. His wardrobe now consisted of serviceable business attire rather than designer suits. His meals were simple but nutritious rather than the gastronomic extravagances that had once punctuated his calendar. Every financial decision was guided by a principle he had developed during his time on the streets. Security required redundancy. A significant portion of each paycheck went into accounts at different financial institutions, physical cash stored in a safe only he could access, and investments diversified beyond what conventional wisdom would suggest. Never again would he be vulnerable to the coordinated financial attack that had stripped him of everything. This time, his resources would be structured to withstand targeted assault from any direction. His knowledge preserved in formats that couldn't be simultaneously compromised. His professional reintegration progressed with similar strategic discipline. James made deliberate efforts to connect with key personnel throughout the organization, particularly those in technical and product development roles who had been marginalized under Dempsey's leadership. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing their insights about what had gone wrong and what could still be salvaged from the company's intellectual property portfolio. These conversations served multiple purposes: gathering critical information about organizational dysfunction, identifying potential allies for future initiatives, and subtly reinforcing his own credibility through demonstrated understanding of complex technical challenges. Unlike Dempsey, who maintained distance from anyone below executive level, James made himself accessible to those actually building and maintaining the company's products, recognizing that their ground-level perspective often contained solutions invisible from the executive suite's rarefied atmosphere. The pivot point came during the quarterly strategy meeting, where Dempsey had reluctantly invited James to present his comprehensive recovery plan to the executive team and board representatives. The conference room hummed with tension as James methodically outlined a 3-year roadmap that would not merely prevent collapse, but potentially restore Crawford Technologies to industry leadership. His presentation contrasted sharply with the glossy, substance-free slideshows that had become standard under current management. Instead of vague aspirations and hockey stick growth projections, he offered specific technical innovations grounded in market realities, precise resource allocations with contingency provisions, and honest acknowledgement of competitive threats alongside concrete strategies to address them. Throughout his presentation, James noticed Dempsey's expression shifting from initial dismissiveness to reluctant engagement, and finally to the dawning recognition that the path forward required fundamentally different leadership than what had brought them to this precipice. "The question isn't whether this approach can work," James concluded, standing confidently before the assembled decision-makers whose actions had once destroyed him. "The financial models and market analysis confirm its viability. The real question is whether this organization has the courage to embrace fundamental change rather than cosmetic adjustments." His gaze swept across the room, acknowledging the discomfort his directness created. "That begins with honest assessment of how we reached this point and what capabilities are required to execute this strategy successfully." He didn't need to explicitly state what everyone in the room already understood. Dempsey and his executive team lacked both the technical vision and operational discipline to implement the comprehensive transformation required. The silence that followed his presentation carried the weight of collective recognition. They had driven out the very leadership they now desperately needed, and the consultant they had reluctantly hired to provide temporary guidance was offering something far more valuable, a viable future that required their own diminishment to achieve. The board's decision came 3 days later. James would be appointed Chief Strategy Officer with expanded authority over both product development and financial planning. Dempsey would remain CEO, but with significantly reduced autonomy, effectively creating a power-sharing arrangement that acknowledged reality without forcing the board to publicly admit their previous errors in judgment. The press release announcing this restructuring carefully framed James's return as a triumphant reunion rather than a desperate corrective measure, with no mention of the circumstances of his previous departure or intervening years. As he read the sanitized corporate announcement from his small apartment, James allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction, not at Dempsey's humiliation, but at the vindication of his own abilities and insight. This wasn't the complete restoration he might have fantasized about during his darkest moments on the streets, but it represented something perhaps more valuable: the opportunity to rebuild on his own terms, with hard-won wisdom that only adversity could have taught him. The fallen titan who had lost everything was rising again, not through luck or charity, but through the persistent application of the same strategic brilliance that had built his first empire, this time tempered by humility and protected by painful experience. 5 months later, Crawford Technologies announced its first profitable quarter in 2 years, driven by a breakthrough in artificial intelligence applications that James had identified and championed against initial skepticism from both Dempsey and the board. The stock price responded with immediate appreciation, and industry analysts who had been predicting the company's demise began cautiously revising their assessments. Investment capital that had been flowing to competitors began returning, attracted by evidence of renewed innovation and financial discipline. Most significantly, talented engineers and developers who had left during the company's decline began reaching out about potential returns, drawn by rumors of cultural transformation under James's growing influence. The resurrection strategy was working even more effectively than his most optimistic projections had suggested, accelerated by market forces eager for alternatives to the dominant players who had filled the void during Crawford Technologies' stumble. James stood at his office window, watching the sunset paint the San Francisco skyline in shades of gold and crimson. He no longer occupied the corner office that had once been his as founder and CEO, that still belonged to Dempsey, though it had become increasingly clear to everyone that actual authority now resided elsewhere. The symbolic trappings of power interested him far less than their practical exercise, influence measured by results rather than titles or office dimensions. His phone vibrated with a notification. Another acquisition offer from a major competitor, the third this month, each with higher valuation than the last. They recognized what the board was only beginning to acknowledge. Under James's strategic guidance, Crawford Technologies had not merely recovered, but transformed into something more valuable than before its crisis. He dismissed the notification without response. Selling now would be premature, interrupting a trajectory that promised far greater returns with slightly longer vision. The homeless man who had once watched this building from across the street, clutching his strategic insights in a ragged notebook, now directed its future from within, not through aggressive power plays or vindictive maneuvers, but through the undeniable effectiveness of his vision and execution. His comeback was not yet complete, but its foundations were set in stone, constructed with the wisdom that only complete devastation could have taught him. James Crawford, once billionaire then homeless, now rising phoenix, allowed himself a rare smile as he turned from the window toward the work still to be done, secure in the knowledge that his greatest achievements lay not behind, but before him.